Hello, everybody. John Spielka here. It's a pleasure to be here for our Growth Innovator series. I'm particularly excited about today because Larry will demur on this, but Larry's the closest thing in my life I've ever met to a Leonardo da Vinci. The man is unbelievable. Let me just give you a little bit of the background and then get at what we're going to get at today, which is all about the quantified self. But to give you an idea of the quality of mind and career that Larry has had, he did his original thesis back in '75 on the collision of black holes. And shortly after he became a faculty member down at Champaign-Urbana, the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, he went out and created the first high-speed backbone to the internet, so that he could do simulations, get the computational power necessary to do simulations of black holes coming through. And in his lab, a number of fantastic things were invented, including the first browser. And then he picked up stakes and went out to Cal IT2, the supercomputing lab that he created, starting out with Governor Gray Davis and then with other leaders after that. And in that lab, I spent a fair amount of time out there. You see amazing things, everything from mapping the global biome, the human biome, the biggest quantification of the human biome ever. For those of you familiar with the Framingham Heart Study, it's kind of the Framingham Heart Study for the human biome. 3D printing technology, drones, massive data visualization. You'll see a little bit of it in his work. Just to name nanotechnology, nanofabrication, it's just, to the curious mind, it is just a treat. And Larry is that wonderful combination of humble genius and has managed to bring together just an amazing amount of things. He's got just a long list of awards. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering, of the American Physical Society, American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He won the Franklin Institute's Delmar Farney Medal for Leadership in Science, the Telluride Tech Festival Award of Technology, and I think one of the most impressive things is he won the Golden Goose Award from the U.S. Congress for his work involving black holes and supercomputing, because the $5 million that they gave Larry and his team turned into an amazing backbone of the internet, the browser, and so forth, which just generated and appropriately named the Golden Goose for the country in general. So it is a great pleasure to introduce my dear friend and genius, Larry Smarr. So welcome, Larry.
Thank you, John. That's way over the edge as usual. It's great to be back with you.
Lovely to be here. Let me take folks through what we're going to get done today. So I gave you the background on Larry. And a word from our sponsor. We at Manifold, we're trying to figure out, if you will, what we call the Manifold growth system, or the Manifold management system for continuous growth for companies. And there's three parts to what we do. And I'm kind of like a kid in a candy store myself here at Manifold, because we have Manifold Advisory, which is traditional consulting. And then we have Manifold Studios, where you get to build stuff, and then Manifold Ventures, where we get to take bets on our ideas and such. And we generally play in the domain of the transformation of industries or organizations enabled by technology, but with some, traditional, real economic and organizational chops and analysis. So it's fun. And growth, what we call healthy growth, which to us is a combination of low entropy and high inclusion, is really the mandate for organizations now and going forward. And we've got some, fun customers that we've worked with over the years. To remind you all, for those of you who have been here before, there's a fundamental theoretical thing underneath what we're doing here, and it absolutely refers to the quantified self. And it's this theory of computability. And what's happening to the world in general, and certainly the world of commerce, is that two things are happening at the same time. And some of this is pointed out by Ray Kurzweil under the notion of the law of accelerating returns back in '99, I think. The world's getting described more and more in symbols. It's being digitized. And at the same time, we have higher and higher knowledge of what's going on. And a simple way to think about knowledge is categorization. Can you say, okay, there's A's, there's B's, there's C's. Correlation, A usually goes with B, and then causation, A causes B. Those are higher and higher levels of knowledge. And what we're talking about, and then the two of those things together equals computability. So if you can digitize it and you have high level of knowledge, you have complete computability. We'll use an analogy today of the evolution of your automobile, and the automobile has become much, much more computable. And what we're talking about today really is how do we think about the computability of human health and the human body and even its environment, and what that looks like over time, and how does that drive our level of knowledge, and also how does it drive, we're going to look at two things in particular. We're going to look at some thoughts about how it might impact providers, there's healthcare providers, basically going from sick care to well care and what that would look like, and also insurers, because when you can compute a future event, how you manage risk in the context of that changes radically, as we've seen with everything from reinsurance to simple car insurance or your home insurance if you have HIPAA with sensors in your house for flooding and so forth. So we think that this fundamental thing, understanding computability, is important because it's changing the nature of power and profitability and control and growth in markets. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Larry, and we'll get into it. Larry.
So, I spent my youth in astrophysics. And the reason I say that is because if you think about it, you read all this stuff that the Hubble Space Telescope and all these things are seeing, but when you look up, you just see points of light, and so that point doesn't tell you if it's a radio galaxy or anything else, and you have to figure out what it is. And so what astronomers have learned over centuries to do is to take time series in, say, visible light and radio and X-ray, and see how, by looking at those time series, in the case of humans, just think of it as like an EKG over time, your heart rhythm over time. And then from that, you can determine a great deal about the state of that object in the sky. And so I grew up doing that. And when I began to think about why aren't we doing that for our own bodies, which are complex, dynamic, multi-component systems, I began to think about, well, let's look at something simpler that's a dynamic, multi-component system, which is an automobile. And I was fortunately at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. One of our industrial partners was Motorola. And so what I learned that I think a lot of people don't realize is that in the 90s, when the personal computer revolution was taking off, creating the great fortunes and Apple and Microsoft and Intel and so forth, 90% of the microprocessors that were made were going into automobiles, not personal computers. And so there was sort of this invisible thing that the cars were being computerized, and also they were putting all kinds of sensors on your brakes, on your spark plugs, on fuel injection, everything. And there was solid state memory that became to be cheap enough that you could put a lot of memory in your car. Your car has 5 different sub networks. It has all kinds. It's like all these computers and all these memories in your car. And the whole point is to just capture time series of a lot of key variables. And so what happens in the 2000s is then, as the internet grew, the ability to link together all of the car service, what we used to call garages, where you take your car in, all got interneted together. And so what happened then is when I was in the 50s and 60s, starting with cars, we had a sick care system for cars. And so the way you knew you needed to do something with your car is smoke was coming out from under the hood, or it was knock, 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 or whatever. And you take it in and they said, oh, you forgot to put in oil. You ruined the engine. You had a chronic disease. And it's going to cost you. It's going to wear the leak, you have to chain, put the whole damn engine up. I mean, you notice that doesn't happen much anymore. And the reason is because we went to preventive health care for your car, in which every 20,000 miles you go in. And what happens is it's not a human, they plug a computer in and read out those time series. But
Mm-hmm.
then they compare it with the population health of all the cars of your make and model.
Mm-hmm.
And they look at you individually, your car individually, and see if one or another of those vital signs is beginning to deviate from either its own normal, because you're, of course, in a very different environment than a car that's identical to yours, make and model, but it's in a very different environment. And so the stresses and what, how it's driven and how long it's driven and what the, is there salt on the street? All these things are different.
Sure.
But because then what you're doing is you have population health, but now you're looking at each car individually, and you're managing the health of each car individually.
Yes.
You're making interventions when you very first begin to see a deviation, which you as the driver have no idea is going on in your car.
Mm-hmm.
But then that pops it back into normal behavior. And so 200,000 miles after you buy your car, it's essentially running as well as it did. In fact, it may have newer parts in it than when you.
Well, it's interesting. I know, our mutual friend, Nick Pudar, when he was, putting OnStar into GM, they did the math, and first they released it just to GM employees. And with that sample, I think it was on the order of 10,000 cars or something like that, they were able to increase their level of knowledge from, correlation, causation. And they believe that they avoided well over $500 million of future warranty costs because of their understanding and engineering changes they can make. I'm talking about, preventative care for the car, and now we have Tesla upgrading its cars by software, right?
So I have a Tesla Model X. It's an old one, 5 years old. Mm-hmm. And it is vastly superior to when I bought it because of the software.
Yes.
And it'll tell me, hey, we have a software upgrade. How about 2 a.m. and my garage is right under where I'm sitting in my office. And so it's got good Wi-Fi. And the next morning, it has all kinds of features that I didn't have literally yesterday, much less 5 years ago when I bought it. Yeah. So even though the entity that you have in your mind's eye, I buy this car and it depreciates half when I drive it off the lot, and then it just continually depreciates over the life of the capital asset.
Right.
In my case, and anybody else who has this kind of thing, your capital asset is increasing in value, with not decreasing.
Yes.
The whole economics is turned upside down.
Yes. Yeah. Well, turning to the quantified self, for those for our audience, Larry, you are obviously super early in this whole thing, and for those of you who follow quantified self, you'll know Larry. For those of you who don't, quantified self is, I think of it as a whole movement and a whole new field of science and concern. And it's as Larry once told me, it's populated by two groups of people. You have the scientific folks and so forth, then you have some whack jobs. But let's leave the whack jobs out for a minute. Let's talk about the scientists. And the idea is to fundamentally look at our bodies differently, measure our bodies differently, think about our role in our health differently, and to me, it's a combination of insight and science as well as behavior and knowledge, so that you can act better and so forth. And that's at the individual level or the family level or the society level. And we're in the very early days of this. In terms of doing it, and it's so different than traditional healthcare, which is very cross-sectional and small data and lots of memory by doctors. So Larry, do you want to give a little sense of how you got into the whole idea of quantified self even before it was called that?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the scientists, but actually with all of the wearables, if you go back to 2000 and to say 2010,
sure,
as they begin to come out, actually it's the athletes.
Yes.
A large part, I would say, the individual athletes, not it of course is for professional teams and stuff like that, but just individuals who are runners or swimmers or marathon or triathlete or whatever, because they are highly motivated to shave a few seconds or to be able to do this. And so they started things like wearing, Fitbits and others that would measure simple things. So like I have a Fitbit. I've had this for or different versions of it, but I have a continuous data stream of this for now 9 years. And so I know for, basically every heart rate and every how many steps, how many calories and everything for a 9 years straight.
Yes.
On a very high time frequency. Well, I noticed when I came from Illinois, which
Yes.
is, if you look at a map of obesity in the country, then you'll see that the heartland, as they call it, and the deep south are the highest levels, because 2/3 of Americans are overweight or obese by now.
Yes.
And so I did not look like I look now. I looked like a typical Midwesterner. And I got off the wagon train from Illinois to San Diego and looked around at all these people, and they didn't look like me.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, gee, if I don't figure out what's going on here, they're going to send me back. And so I got a personal trainer, and I started thinking about what I was eating.
Yep.
And I started cutting out a lot of the stuff that drives us to having chronic diseases that we eat.
Sure.
And I started losing weight and everything else. And as I was doing it, I said, well, I got to keep track of all this. So I started measuring more and more of my body, but I assumed I was healthy. But I noticed that when I would go in and, you get an annual physical and they do some blood work or something, and I started looking at those numbers, because most of us don't think about homocysteine or secretory IgA or your any of your liver enzymes or anything. And what I realized is, they tell you, well, they're normal, or you're a little low or a little high. And one of them, a complex reactive protein in your blood, was like 5 times above the normal.
Wow.
Well, what is that thing? And it turned out it measures your inflammation. And I actually had high levels of inflammation. And by 2012, call it, I was 30 times the upper limit for inflammation in my body. And of course, I was shocked, because I had this time series and I was saying, I'm getting worse. And I would go in to my doctor and they'd say, well, do you have a symptom? I said, no, I got data.
Right.
Said, get out of here. You're wasting my time. I only look at people that are sick.
Yes.
And I said, but I'm going to be sick. I got something going on inside of me. Anyway, that was what led me into then starting to take what is now every month or two a whole series of blood tests. I probably measure 100 and something variables in my blood. And then, I was always one of the early adopters for the genomics, your human genomics. So I was early 23andMe. I had my whole human genome done by 3 different leaders of this, by Craig Benner and George Church and Lee Hood, and the pioneers of genome sequencing.
Yes.
And then because it's sort of funny, but I ended up being asked to be on the advisory committee to the director of the National Institutes of Health, which is the highest level advisory committee in the country for this. I was the only one that wasn't a liver doctor or a brain doctor or something, around the table. And I was like, why did they invite me? And of course, it was what you said in that first slide, that there's this what looks like a slow digitization of the human organism, but it's actually exponential. And we are very bad at noticing that there's exponential change underway.
Yes.
But that's what was going on. And so I began to see this in terms of policy at the NIH and that sort of thing.
Yep.
And so then because I'm a scientist, I just said, well, wow, this is a cool new field. So I've just been gathering more and more data, including my microbiome.
Yes.
And then it taught me a lot of things I wasn't aware of about myself, which we can get into.
Yes. Yeah. Well, let's get into some of the data. So this notion of self-knowledge through self-tracking, right? The other thing I just would like to highlight again is that, because I think for folks who are not accustomed to doing a lot of data analytics and so forth, the difference between cross-sectional data looking for variance against norms, if you will, which is what we all get when we go to the doctors. Hey, you pre-diabetic or not? Is your cholesterol too high or not? Versus watching longitudinal analyses over time, and medicine has very few of those, and so it really is that kind of new field, and I think the impact is going to be as great. And then, I know, Larry, you and I were kicking around this. When you step back and you look, there's no question that the big providers and some other big companies are into this, right? So when Google buys Fitbit to try to catch up to the Apple Watch, you and I were just kicking around about the numbers. There's over 100 million Apple Watches out there as of the early part of this year. And it's kind of fun when you look at which parts of the body. But you have other folks, right? The Chinese are doing this, through Huawei. The Samsung has got a big, over $5 billion, healthcare device capability. And then you start looking at just all different parts of our lives will start to, whether it's your phone or your car or whatever, start to be, enabled to do sampling of what's going on with the people inside. So this whole notion of, a sensor-based environment driving to more and more of a digital twin of everyone, I think is pretty clear. So I think that's, then obviously the global wearable technology market, it's a big number, 32 billion, we've got a $20 trillion global economy. For me, I think it's interesting to look at, we're instrumenting all this stuff. That's a big market, but more importantly is the impact of those insights. So when we're looking at, roughly $4 trillion of the U.S. economy being spent on health, the big number is what you can do with that information. And we'll talk a little bit about it, about provision and risk. But I don't know if you want to say anything else here. We'll get into some of the data that you're sharing with us.
Yeah, we'll move forward another slide. Yeah, so this is at my institute that you were talking about.
Yes.
That's a 64 million pixel wall. So that's 32 screens like the one that our viewers are looking at on their PCs. And each of those screens, I have the graph over 8 years of one of the variables, like my insulin or my glucose or my ALT or AST, my two liver enzymes, or my cholesterol numbers, my HDL, my LDL. So that's what all those are. But you normally, I think almost all you that are listening might have those once on a piece of paper that your doctor may or may not hand to you.
Sure.
And you don't see all those, see all those spikes,
Yes.
So you're much more dynamic, is what I discovered by using my own body as an observatory into the human. That's what offended me. I just turned myself into a data generator. And then the ones that are green mean that all the oscillations going on are between the upper and lower normal limits across the population. But you'll notice some of them are yellow, and then a couple of them are red. Yeah. And those are the ones in which I'm definitely way above normal healthy values. And I
Yes.
had no idea. And the reason is because the idea that you can intuit, that through your brain, you can intuit the actual chemical values in your bloodstream is a hallucination. I mean, it's just insane.
Right.
And it was very clear that I could show that. Now, yes, as time went on, I began to develop more and more symptoms because it turned out what I'd learned, and when I got into, well, why did I have such high inflammation? I looked at my genome, and in particular, the what are called the SNPs, the single nucleotide polymorphisms, where you differ from the population at a particular point in your DNA.
Mm-hmm.
And that in the last few decades, they've been able to take various diseases and take people that have those diseases and people that don't have the diseases, compare their human genomes, and find where there are genetic predispositions.
Yes.
I had a predisposition for an autoimmune disease called Crohn's. And so I actually figured out by 2012, I must have Crohn's. I must have a form of inflammatory bowel disease.
Yes.
And up until that point, no doctor had said, hey, maybe you have this. It just, because first of all, I was doing stool tests as well. I couldn't get my doctor to do those, but by then, online tests where you could just order a stool kit and then put, some stool in it, send it off in FedEx, and then you get back the numbers. It turned out I was 125 times the upper limit for inflammation in my colon. I had no idea, except that I started bloating and I started bleeding, out the end of that particular tube, and so on, having cramps and all this, and so it was basically that I before I actually got into the chronic stage of the disease, I was able to tell I was on a trajectory,
yes,
headed toward that. And then from maybe 2012 until about 2016, the next 4 years, I was very episodically sick with Crohn's, which of course you may know, or you may have yourself similar ulcerative colitis or Crohn's. And so I started learning a lot more about that. And we were very fortunate that Dr. Bill Sanborn, who spent 20 years at the Mayo Clinic as one of the world's experts on IBD, had been recruited to UC San Diego. Mm-hmm. So I was able to start having him as a doctor, which was a huge relief, because he understood what I was talking about.
Yes.
And had written a lot of he was a researcher, so he'd written a lot of scientific papers on this, and in particular, he'd written a lot of papers on how you use particular measurements of biomarkers in your blood and your stool as indicators of IBD. And so that was a very unusual doctor. And we published papers together now with my data generated from my body and his vast knowledge as well. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, Larry, too. I know you're retired from Cal IT2, but is it true that you guys also created the software to do this massive data display and dealing with this tremendous amount of data?
Yeah, we wrote all the software ourselves. We have teams of I basically spent the last 40 years in building collaborative innovation, and so we bring together people in software, people from disciplines like medicine or wildfires or whatever it is. Yes. And then we use the very latest in technology to do that. And the most recent is machine learning, where of course when you begin to get enough data like this, you can begin to go from simple statistics to machine learning. And why don't you go to the next slide, because I want to say where this led me to.
Sure.
So by 2016,
just before you do this, for folks who are listening, if your organization's on that leading edge of trying to figure out data visualization and analysis and so forth, the standard tools aren't going to get you there usually. And so a lot of the stuff that Larry's lab did, some of it's open source, some of it's through sponsorship and stuff. It's just there are a few places where you can really get both the compute power, the display, the analytic expertise, the data expertise, and so forth. And another time we'll talk about, Larry and the academic community is really building these tools to deal with these massive data sets that we're going to get out of this computable reality. So I just wanted to kind of bookmark that.
Well, I'll tell you in particular that at UC San Diego, we now have we got a private donation that allowed us to create a data science institute. And we have about 600 undergraduate majors in data science now at UCSD.
Not great.
And it's happening across many of the leading universities now. Are developing an entire new curriculum around data science, and it of course is going to attack everything. And so all of those data that I'm making, I'm working now with the Data Science Institute to make those public, so that we can get all kinds of people. I have no idea who they are coming in and beginning to use these constantly increasing capabilities of machine learning. And pattern analysis to discover things. And then that is my son, actually, Benjamin Smarr, is now a professor at UC San Diego in that Data Science Institute.
Oh.
And he's been working with, this is an Aura ring, which measures your temperature, your heart rate variability, your respiratory rate. And working with UC San Francisco during the COVID pandemic, they started gathering those time series from healthcare frontline healthcare workers.
Yes.
And then people who have these could opt in. They now have something over 50,000 individuals who have these time series. And so they're building, for the first time, as far as I know, a human time series database that's the software is organized around the idea that these are humans databases from wearables, but also they're going to add all my data in as well.
Yes.
So I think this hasn't happened because there wasn't enough people generating the data. But now,
right,
the wearables, as you mentioned, 100 million Apple Watches, now the software begins to follow the data. And so these software infrastructures begin to happen. And once that happens, then medical folks can say, well, the patients have more data than are in my medical record. How do I get a hold of that? And so you're going to see what we call a future doctor as well as a future patient.
Yeah.
In that they're going to be early adopter people in the healthcare profession that decide, okay, I can't let this train go by without getting on it. And it's not going to be everybody. It's going to be like any other technological thing.
Yeah.
There'll be early adopters, late.
Yeah, I mean, my prediction is that as we want to, talk about some of the implications, and we'll get back to your 3D visualization in a sec here. Just in terms of talking about implications, I think that in insurance, in particular, in any industry, if you look across the history of an industry, there are certain times where increase in research and development gives you a big breakthrough advantage. And I would say right now that in insurance, especially anything around health and so forth, that doing R&D into this area is going to give people, a breakthrough advantage. And we don't know what it is yet. That's why they call it research. But, just like the property casualty insurance business, when they added credit, completely transformed as an underwriting variable. I think there are underwriting variables and models to be discovered here. Just like there were, reinsurance had a revolution about 15 years ago with the addition of new kinds of modeling. So you have an industry like insurance that doesn't have a history really of much research and development, and certainly health insurance and so forth. But here, I would advocate that the potential yield is unbelievable because you have. Mm-hmm.
Let me just take that example. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, well. that's great for you, Larry. But if I went into my doctor and said I wanted to do 100 variables,
Right.
which is about 12 vials of blood, I do every month or two.
Yes.
They'd say, well, the insurance won't pay for it because they would say nobody gets that many records. So insurance right now is the bottleneck.
Yes.
It's what's stopping more people from getting these time series.
Yes.
But what you're talking about is that there will be some in the insurance industry who get that a revolution, like we saw with when Steve Jobs was a genius enough to make iTunes, and how that completely flipped that entire industry.
Right.
And so some of them are going to be say, well, hey, like the car insurance, maybe if we put a little sensor in the car and
right.
we give your time series on how you as an individual drive your car,
right.
maybe even though that's a capital cost for us up front, maybe we could begin to switch our whole portfolio of insurance to give rewards to the better drivers and to shift our whole risk portfolio.
Right. Yes.
Well, it's inevitable that that's going to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah, and just like pharma is dealing with what they call real world data, right? Trying to update their models and so forth. And the vaccine being one of those things, I think the leading insurers can do this. Just out of curiosity, Larry, about how much dough does that cost you to get all those measures every month?
Well, currently, and I'd say my insurance is covering this because I do have a number of health issues that have occurred. So the codes for them.
If you were doing it out of pocket, I mean, $100.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's hundreds of dollars, maybe $1,000 or something like that.
Yeah, so I mean, you think about, if for an insurance company, and they could obviously get cheaper prices. Let's say it costs them $500 to $1,000, and somewhere between a couple thousand to at the most $10,000 a year.
Yeah.
You get longitudinal data points across. You don't have to spend a lot.
A day or two in the hospital.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like the current infrastructure budget right now. People talk about 6.3 trillion. It's actually that's over 10 years. It's actually just 2 F-22s a year. So anyway, that's not a whole conversation. The 2 planes a year and rebuild the infrastructure. But yes, I mean, I just it would be it would take some selling by the innovators within an insurance company, but the data cost to get a true data that is unique and valuable is really not high for a large company.
Well, and in particular, I'm working with several doctors now that are with private sector people with private practices, and they're going out and finding that they can cut deals with places like Quest and LabCorp and so
Sure.
Get a panel that does a lot of this stuff, and because it's done as a whole, they can bring the cost way down.
Yes.
And so they're beginning to do this for their patients, just based as an example off of what they've seen me do.
Yes.
But let me take it one step further, because this is just time series. But what about imaging? And so what I have done a lot of computer graphics, as you could see, but I've worked on this for decades. And so when you go in and get an MRI, you get it comes back as these slices, these black and white slices, and the radiologist looks at it. The doctor probably never looks at it. And they look at what the paragraph that the radiologist wrote about what they saw. And I said, well, what is that about? And so I said, it turns out there's a standard DICOM is the standard format for these things. I said, just give me the DICOM file. And I took it into my guys and I said, okay, make a 3D transparent Larry out of this.
Mm-hmm.
Because we've known in computer graphics how to do this for several decades. Because like if you go to SIGGRAPH, I remember the first time I saw a transparent human made out of a 2D slices of MRI or CAT scan.
Sure.
And so we started doing that. And then I spent a lot of time inside my body, wandering around inside my body. Weird experience for most people. And you see here, the big yellow thing is the aorta. That orange at the top is my liver. And I'm holding a 3D printout of a portion of my colon, my sigmoid colon, where the inflammation was localized. And because I had a 3D, I could just send it to one of my 3D printers. And so I could go into the doctor's office and say, well, here's the diseased part of my colon that is causing me to get more and more. And in fact, I said to my wife in 2016, I'm going to explode if something doesn't happen. When we did this high resolution, we found out that my opening in one part of that colon was down to 4 millimeters.
Wow.
Everything was trying to get pushed through to out the back end through 4 millimeter opening. And so I was just like a balloon, because I was filling up. So we actually have a 3-dimensional room you walk into for virtual reality with glasses. I brought my surgeon over and I said, well, as long as you're going to be inside me cutting, why don't you and I, as a doctor, decide where you're going to cut my 6 inches of my colon and extract it right here, right now? And she said, well, usually we wait till I'm inside of you and they're using a Da Vinci, laparoscopic robot. And I look around and I said, yeah, but why do we want to wait until you're inside me with a bunch of cutters when you can know right now?
Right. Sure.
Said, well, gee, we've never done that before. And I thought, well, think of the first airplane pilot who, when they said, well, what happens when you run through a thunderstorm in a jetliner? He says, I don't know. Figure it out when that happens. I said, well, we got this thing called a simulator. Why don't you try it a few times and develop your skill set a little bit before you actually run into one?
That's great.
And then of course we think you wouldn't get in a plane that a pilot hadn't been through simulators, right? But this was the first time for this very experienced surgeon. She's actually the head of colorectal surgery for UC San Diego Health. But she's got then the Helmsley Foundation found out about this, which is the largest funder for Crohn's disease. And so they provided us with a $1 million grant, and we've now done 10 more patients like this. But my point is to figure out where all of this is inside of you. Where's the colon? We're using machine learning. We actually train up our neural nets on individual patients of what is a colon, where's the aorta, where's the liver, where's the spleen, where's the bladder, and then we apply that and that comes back with a first version, and then a skilled doctor who knows anatomy goes in and says, well, it's not quite right here, it's not right here. So now the human is tweaking the AI. Now the AI is smarter. And then the next patient comes along, we get another one, and it just gets better and better. And so this is a whole new way that is going to be using machine learning. And we're all going to have transparent versions of ourselves in our medical record in the next, it'll probably take 5 to 10 years, but it can be done.
Yeah. Well, and the amazing thing too, and you and I've talked about this, if you study biology in school or whatever, you have that, beautiful, diagram that you pull out, the liver's green and the lungs are yellow or whatever, and they're all in the same place. You talk to a surgeon, it's like, yeah, it's not, everything's red and it's not all the same. And some people are, whether
very different.
I
think we found that with these 10 patients. And we were working with a team of our top doctors, surgeon, radiologist, GI, head of GI, gastrointestinal. And as I look at each of them, I was fascinated to listen to the doctors. They said, oh my God, I can't believe how tied up that colon is. That's a train wreck. And but they didn't have this methodology. They had in fact, we take the colonoscope video of the when you have a colonoscopy.
Yeah.
We add that in too. So this is just a new tool that's enabled by what you started the whole hour about.
Yep.
That this is the digitization of your entire body. And then because of that, it becomes computable, and you can begin to model it, and you can begin to then measure the differences
Yes.
between it. And, I mean, imagine, everybody's now doing their own stock portfolio and everything. I mean, imagine you didn't have individual time series. You couldn't tell the difference in the return between one and another.
Sure.
What would you do?
Yeah.
So it's coming. I think it's fabulous that it's coming to healthcare.
Yeah. Well, one of the questions we have from Daniela Terizzi is this notion of what do we do and how do we make this framework of medicine with the genetics and so forth. I mean, I think that I know that you participated in, there's some public goods being created, like I forget what it's called, the 1 millimeter man or something anyway. So now there's a CAT scan model that we actually have data representations that are much more robust. You're creating, you see San Diego, this human gut biome project, which is creating both proprietary insight, but also an unbelievable set of, it's essentially terra incognita, right? It's like when we talk about the human gut biome from a genetics perspective, I mean, it's as opaque as, the New World was to Columbus, right? And so we're you're putting the basic maps in place. So I think it's about the creation of some of these public goods and models and data, and then of course, corporations and so forth will build on that. The other thing, Larry, I also want to interject here is, I think people underestimate how big a difference this can make, because one of the guys at my thesis committee was Patrick Henry Winston III, who you know well. And at the time he was running the AI lab at MIT. And Pat said something which always stuck with me. He said, and he's one of the world's experts in AI, starting in the 80s and before. And he said, a lot of people talk about advances in algorithms and technique. He said, a lot of the breakthroughs in AI is when you have a new representation system. So you're collecting new data, and so when you're looking at a 3D model like we are here on the screen, and you're talking about longitudinal data and the relationship, it changes the way you represent the problem, which then allows you new kinds of data analysis. And we go back to the car, if you think about the GPS system as an extension and representation, where we are in XY space, a little bit Z, but mostly XY space, that any device or anything can be put on a grid, Cartesian grid around the world, that new in a dynamic way, that new representation system becomes a scaffolding that you can hang so many things off. So Daniela, I think that we've got, insights that can be shared. I think that there's data assets, but I think also we're starting to evolve a new way of thinking about health, the body, humans, groups of humans, that will be a scaffolding that lots of things will hang on.
Well, and the thing is with exponentials is, you see something, a crazy person like me doing this stuff, as a gentleman scientist, as a hobby or whatever. I mean, and the next thing you know, it's everywhere. And that's just the way exponentials work. So I was on an advisory meeting yesterday with Lee Hood. Lee Hood is one of the most important biomedical wizards in our lifetime, and he invented the gene sequencer and developed a lot of the technologies that we all take for granted. He right now is working with Congress to put in a million person version of me. So in other words, the full phenome, the full longitudinal time series of all these variables, including ones I'm not even measuring, plus the full human genome across 1 million people with a very diverse set of, we're looking at African-American community, Hispanic communities, immigrant communities, trying to get a very diverse set in that million.
Yes.
And the whole project is called Beyond the Human Genome.
Fascinating.
And you're going to hear more and more about that. It hasn't been funded yet, but I remember being at this stage, when John, you and I were talking together in the early 2000s when
Yeah.
the human genome, which was one person's human genome,
Right.
hadn't been funded, and there was the big battle between NIH and Craig Venter and so forth. But that was 20 years ago.
Yep. Yeah. So within 20 years, we'll have this.
So
you don't know the price tag on that, do you? That he's looking for?
No, it's it's billions as the
If it's $1,000 a person, it's $1 billion.
Yeah, but the problem is that's the whole point of why we have when you did the first human genome,
Right.
it was several $1 billion. It's now $100.
Right. Oh yeah.
20 years later. And so the idea is to drive down the cost of all these lab tests so that you can, in fact, many of these will be in your home. Many of these you'll just, you'll be able to monitor your own health in the privacy of your bathroom or whatever, and you'll have all of this social media and ability to put stuff into the cloud. All of this stuff that's coming from my Apple Watch, from my Fitbit, from the Aura, it's all in the cloud. And I wake up every morning with my wife, who's also got wearing these things, and then we just download the graphs of what happened during the 7 to 8 hours we were asleep.
Yes.
I mean, think about it. You have no idea
what
was happening to your precious body because you were unconscious.
Right.
Well, these weren't.
Right.
And so I get this great story. Oh my God, I see what happened to my heart rate and my heart rate variability and my respiratory rate. And I was down, I mean.
Yeah. And
it's crazy that we don't know this stuff.
And some people may say, hey, I don't want to do that. That's fine. I mean, you look at, there's a well-known segmentation study in personal finance. You're talking about, the understanding. And look, there's one way to look at it is that there's three big segments in personal finance. There are self-directed folks like you. There are folks who kind of want to look over the shoulder of an expert. So you go to the doctor, but you want to look at the data too. You see that in finance. And then there are delegators. It's like, okay, here's my money. Go make me money. Right. And I think we'll have those segments in this as well. Right. There'll be the people who say, but even the delegators want to make sure that the people who are investing their money have the right technology and the right insights and the right data. And so that transformation is underneath. And my guess is that right now we've got the vast majority of delegators, but we're going to get look over the shoulder and self-directed to a much greater degree.
Yeah, and I want to make it clear. I'm not telling people they should be like me. I'm just trying to say that me and the other people like me that are early adopters in this are just straws in the wind of a major change that's coming to wellness and to, as you say, insurance, the whole medical, but also I think it's going to make a huge difference in a lot of industries, the food industry and all these others. So it's just to re-alert that that's coming and to start putting on the lenses that let you see that change coming as it happens. Literally, it's happening monthly, yearly now at a pretty high rate. And it's before the, it's like, how I just remember the shock when Blockbuster all of a sudden wasn't any longer.
Sure.
And Tower Records closed.
Right.
We saw all of this coming, but then when it actually comes to the first shall be last and the last shall be first moment.
Yeah.
It always seems like such a shock to everybody. Where did that come from?
Yeah, it's funny because I wasn't a good enough salesperson. We actually pitched Blockbuster on a whole how they could take the data they had in the stores, and we had a telecommunications strategy where they could do a deal. Level 3 was involved, and other people where we're going to use some, new kinds of subscriptions, and we basically had the whole Netflix idea.
Yeah.
But we couldn't get it sold at Blockbuster. They're like,
because you can't, because the people who have gotten very good at the old way of doing things aren't the ones. It wasn't the buggy whip manufacturers who went into making automobiles. It wasn't the horse people
Sure.
made automobiles. This is just a classic market
Sure.
transition.
Sure. And Larry, I'm a little mindful of time. I've got about 5 minutes left here. There's a couple of things. First of all, it's great to hear Bob Hebler, old friend. Glad to see you, Bob. Was saying, hey, look, this has already happened with Tesla, right? Tesla's launching an insurance company because they have better. I would think of it as underwriting variables, and they already have the relationship in place and so forth. So adding the insurance on.
Very good point. Very good point.
And then Carrie Nee has a question about, okay, do you also track your brain health? And we've only got a short time because I have to set us up for the next thing. And maybe we can get you back again, Larry, to talk some more because, I think the implications of this, I just talked, and you and I talked about before, we're talking a little bit about providers who are going to have to track you over time. It's not just going to be, and we're actually doing work with a couple of providers, and it's more horizontal and in hospital, outpatient, rehab, in home, and trying to get that, and the implications of that. We're doing it for what we call care pathways, another thing, rehab tracker. And the financial implications just on efficiency on the provider side are massive. Never mind the satisfaction of thing and the coordination across those steps horizontally for most organizations is just abysmal. I mean, it's not just.
Well, let me specifically answer her question. It was her, I think, that about the brain health. Yeah, I should be doing a lot more online things where it's kind of like games or something, but what they're doing is measuring a lot of things, memory, all kinds of brain function. I do have a time series of brain MRIs, so I'm actually tracking anatomy. But one of the biggest breakouts that's going to come is emotion tracking. When you sit here all day long with this thing, looking at, while your thumbs are doing all this stuff, while you're looking at this thing, notice there's a camera looking at your face. That camera we showed in our lab 15 years ago. You can put a mesh over your face, tracking all the muscle groups, and you can tell your emotional state vastly better than you, the individual, think what your emotional state is. And because you're getting that data through time, you can begin to see correlations about it and so forth. So I think emotion tracking and mental health tracking is going to be a huge breakout market that is going to be dominant in the next 5 years from now. We will be talking about steps. We'll be talking about mental health tracking.
Absolutely. Well, Larry, so much more. I hope you'll come back again, and you'll have a chance to go in depth in a couple of the different areas, because I think what you said about the implications for other industries, when you think about longitudinal tracking, what happens to a human, and on McDonald's, I mean, I think McDonald's is going to be looking at what the football folks are looking at today as people track longitudinally what happens to their body, and not just McDonald's, all kinds of food providers. And that's going to be really interesting to see what that all means as we articulate this. Awesome. Well, thank you, Larry. As always, not enough time and too much fun. And let me just, I'm going to hop over these for a minute. We talked about providers and insurers. Just to get an idea, this is a sensor that now, in terms of the rest of the story, this is a brand new sensor. Just it's printable. You don't even have to get it's above the skin for measuring blood glucose. So the sensor, another whole conversation we could have is the sensor technology is just going wild in a good way. And so this is just going to explode. And just like the human genome decreased 10 times faster than Moore's law, I think our articulation of the self is going to happen at a just dizzying speed.
Absolutely.
If you're interested in this, you can certainly share this, with your colleagues. And at Manifold, we're all about growth, and we have a kind of Creative Commons mentality, if you will. So we're willing to share this stuff, have a conversation. If we can get Larry, great, or just conversation about these things. If you're interested in your organization or so forth. And then we also have, we profile some organizations that are able to do this kind of investment conversion well. So we have a massive database that looks at growth and and who turns it into economic value. And now we're starting to do growth innovators and having profiles of those. So the second one we have, this is on Teledoc, and how they manage to have a process to increase their economic value by over 100% per year over the past 3 years, for example, and what you can learn about the true growth innovators. So we have a whole set of data and approach on that. Next month, we're going to go to a mutual friend of ours, Chunka Moy. He has got a new book coming out about designing perfect futures in the context of all this change. And given how much technological change we have and available, the context of what I call practical imagination is really going to be our guiding light, because we're going to be able to do lots of things, so we have to decide what we want to do. And Chunka is a great thinker, futurist, and humanist. And
fabulous person.
Yeah, and a wise man in general. So with that, I hope you all can grow in a healthy way, and we'll see you again next month. And thank you, Larry.
Glad to be here.